game object logic, but this player spawn, just a few things. I'm going to spawn a rigid body at the same position of this sphere, and I'm just going to I'm going to head off a bug that's going to happen, which is I don't want to collide with this sphere when I spawn into the position. I don't want two colliders occupying the same space, because then I'll get weird things happening. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to deactivate the collider, in this case on the sphere. Later I'll use an empty game object. We don't have to worry about it. But right now, this is just a visual to let me visualize more clearly where my spawn point is going to be. So here's the idea. We want to, when we die, when our health goes down to 0, we want to spawn at this location, okay? Or even when our game starts, we want to spawn at this location. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start talking about this concept of accessing information from other game objects, which is a really powerful thing. And we kind of started to do it a little bit when we were printing text to screen through our user interface, or our UI. We started to kind of look out to other objects and you know, talk to certain parameters. We're going to do this through our health manager on our isDead state, because the first thing we're going to want to do is, you know, maybe we'll print some stuff to screen, but we eventually want to move our player back to the spawn point. Okay, and so the way that we're going to do this is we're going to do a get position, set position. Okay, the health manager is going to manage this thing. We're going to get the position of our spawn point and set the position of our player to the spawn point. Okay, so the health manager is going to look at an object, identify its position in space, and then move our player over to it. So the health manager is going to talk to two different objects that don't, that are not children of the object, or it's not related to in any way. So the first thing I'm going to do is I want to get the position of this spawn point. Now remember, this is on the health manager, and this is at the dead state, so that when we're dead, this action will occur. And this is a transform action. Anytime we're dealing with anything that has to do with position, scale, and rotation, we're talking about the transform. And what I want to do is I want to get position. So I'll double click and get position. Now, by default, typically when we run actions, whenever we assign an action in Playmaker, the game object usually defaults to itself, or the owner of the game object. And in this case, I don't care where the health manager is in space. What I'm most interested in is the spawn point. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this. I don't want to use owner. I want to specify a game object. Now, once we're specifying a game object, we could use a variable. We could use, there's a number of things that we can do, but in this case, I'm going to directly link to this game object. I could do this two ways. I could click and drag the object into this game object field by going to player spawn, click and drag, and drop this into this where it says none, and release it. Now you can see that it's looking at the player spawn object. Okay, I'll undo that. Alternatively, what I can do, see if I can Command Z, there we go. Alternatively, what I can do is I can specify game object, and I can click on this little bullet to the right of it. And when I click on this bullet, this will give me access to every asset within my scene or in my assets folder. And I don't want to link to something that's outside my project right now. I want to focus on things that are in the scene. And I can choose it from the list here, okay? Not going to choose it from the list, but I can search for up here. So I know it's called spawn, so if I wanted to, I could type in spawn, but it's a pretty simple scene right now. But I want to reinforce the value of naming your objects. So player spawn, I'll double click, and now you can see that it's looking at the position of the player spawn. Okay, once we get the position of the player spawn, we need to capture that data. Even though we can look at it and know what it is right now, we have to store that information because we want to pass it to the player. Okay, so this is the reason we use variables. We're looking at the player position, and now we have a choice to store it in one of these parameters. If we just were concerned with the spawn's position X, Y, or Z, we could use any one of these coordinates. But because we want its position in space in X, Y, Z, we want to use the vector 3, which is this vector drop-down menu here. Okay. Really what we're doing behind the scenes is we're going to the variables tab. We're creating a new variable. I'll call this spawn position. And then we're going to create a vector3, and I'll hit add. That's what we're doing behind the scenes. But Playmaker makes it easy for us to go to vector, click on this drop-down menu, and make a new variable. And I'm going to call this player always lowercase on the front end of our variables, never with any numbers. But once we establish that lowercase, we can use uppercase. Because you might call a parameter inside Unity, like a function within Unity, if it's uppercase. Okay. If you happen to use something that Unity is looking for when it's running in the background, running its code, you could inadvertently initiate activate a class or a function that Unity reserves certain things within its, which we'll come across some of those a little bit later. But lowercase allows us to avoid all those issues. We don't want to include any spaces in the naming convention, but we can use capital letters after that. So I have debug turned on, so I can see that I'm capturing this position, or at least I will once it passes through this state. If I feel like I need to debug this to see if get position is working properly, one workflow that I'll use all the time is I'll temporarily set a state as a start state. That way when I run, it's not running any logic but this state. Now I can see that I'm capturing the position of the spawn. Okay? I don't need to do it every frame because I don't anticipate the spawn point moving over time. But we're capturing that position. And I'll go back to a start state. So we get the position of the spawn state. The next thing that we want to do is we want to set the player's position. By default right now, our player just kind of shows up ready to play based on whatever its default position is inside the scene. Okay, so our player is kind of over by these boxes. Okay, but in our health manager, once we reach our dead state, we're going to get the position of the spawn. The next thing we want to do is set the position of a game object, and we find that in the same transform category. We're looking for set position, and I'll double click to add this. I don't want to set the owner, I want to set the player, right? Because I want to move the player back to this spawn point. So just like I did before, we're going to specify the game object. And the game object that we want to set its position, in this case, would be the player. So I'll go find my rigid body FPS controller. This is a parent object, right? It comes with other stuff, so we want to make sure that we have the parent object and we're going to set its position. Okay? The position that we want to set it to is the thing that we've captured up here, which happens to be a vector3. So we'll borrow that vector3 variable that we made. Okay? Now we could have hardwired this set position. We could have, captured these coordinates and manually entered these in here, but the minute that we have this spawn point as a dynamic, identifying what the spawn location is, this should be testable logic at this point. Actually, let me toggle the play button here for a second. Just to make sure, I'm going to move my spawn point up. So the logic here is that my player should spawn at the position of the player spawn once it's dead, okay? Or once it has died. I'll find my health manager, I'll hit play, and remember, we're looking for that threshold of health to go below 0. So once I pick up 2 cubes, it gets the position of the spawn point and moves the player to it. We're still in our dead state, but we can solve that without too much trouble, right? Any suggestions on how I would have solved this for now based on our current logic?
When position becomes block, go back to init?
We could do that, but we already know that we're setting the position to the spawner, so I think we can simplify this by saying, okay, this is a pretty good situation where we're going to get position, and we're getting position of the spawn. We know we're doing that successfully. And then we're setting the position of the player. We know we're doing that successfully. So this is a great instance where we'll create a finished event. So when those 2 bits of logic that don't come equipped with their own finished event, when those are satisfied, when they're done running, and we'll just loop back to our, in this case, initialization, right? That's where we establish health. So if we're dead, we're going to move back to the spawn point, and then we get new health. Because if we don't, if we pass it right back here, I'm going to save first. I'm going to crash. Definitely going to crash Unity right now. Why am I going to crash Unity?
Because you're creating an infinite loop.
Yeah, right. So health, once it passes to the dead state, is set to 0. If I wire it back to this place where I'm checking my health, remember I evaluate against 0, and I haven't reset the health here. So I'm going to go back to check the health, and then make it dead, back and forth. So I've basically created this loop right here that there's no condition for it to stop. And so Playmaker is pretty good about breaking out of play. The pause button fired off, and it's giving me a hint as to where it broke down. And over here it said, we looped more than 1,000 times during refresh. So we got caught in this loop cycle of saying our health is 0, and when it's 0, pass it over to is dead. We're going back here and saying, okay, what's our current health? We didn't reset it, it's 0. So we're ping-ponging back and forth. So we have broken logic. So I'll toggle the play button and I'll fix that. In this case, I could just make sure that I pass through that reinitialization for player health. And that's where we reestablish whatever we want our starting health to be. Okay, so I can increase my health, and once I die, I respawn. Okay, now the kind of the really nice thing about making this dynamic by searching for the position of the player spawn, or searching for a game object that happens to be called player spawn, is that now we can move this object, and wherever this object lives, that's where we're going to respawn, because we're getting the current position wherever it's at. Okay, so and we can.
So far, can you assign multiple respawn?
Yes.
Location?
Yeah. And let me